This is Dr. Rob Harder with the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast, Making Your World Better. What does it take to be an effective nonprofit leader today? What are the biggest challenges? What are the biggest obstacles? How should nonprofits fundraise in an economy that is constantly changing? All of these reasons combined led me to start this show. And it's my hope that through this series, people can learn not only what it takes to be an effective nonprofit organization, but to hear from effective leaders who are successfully making a positive impact in their communities. We hope you enjoy the show as together we hear how they are making their world better. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. Whether you're listening from Baltimore or Berlin or Bangladesh, we're really glad you're tuning in today. Welcome to the show. Well, if you've been listening for a while, you know I've had, over the years, several different representatives from foundations, large national foundations, that talk about their giving priorities and what they look for as to where and how and to whom they give their money. Now, today's going to be no different. I've got a foundation I'm guessing many of you have heard of. It's called the Annie E. Casey Foundation. They focus specifically on making sure that children and youth in the United States, regardless of race, ethnicity, or zip code, that they have a bright future. And they do work all over the country. And today, my guest is Tomi Hiers. She's the vice president of the Foundation's Center for Civic Sites and Community. And Tomi's going to share several takeaways from their most recent report on the Changing the Odds report. And I think it'll give you some great insights as a nonprofit leader today as to how you can apply what they're learning into your work in your own community. And as always, thanks for tuning in. Now on to the show. This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business. Well, welcome to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. Tomi, it's so great to have you on the show. Now, we've had several representatives from various large national foundations, and so this is going to be kind of fun to have you on the show because I want to talk about the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Many people I know have heard of that foundation, but perhaps they haven't heard exactly what you're all about, some of the priorities that you have and where you invest your money. So maybe you could start with that. Talk a bit about your role, and then where are you working around the country when it comes to the foundation?
Sure. And thanks for having me, Rob. I'm really excited to be here to talk about our work. So the Annie E. Casey Foundation, because there's 3 Casey foundations actually in the country, we refer to ourselves as cousins. The Annie E. Casey Foundation, it's a private philanthropy, and we are focused on helping young people have brighter futures. And for us, that means making sure that young people have the family connections, the relationships, the sense of community, the educational and employment opportunities that they need to thrive. And core to that work is advancing racial equity, because we know that children and families of color often face the greatest barriers to success. And that's something that the Changing the Odds report that I know we're going to talk about a little bit later highlights. And so therefore, our mission, it's simultaneously simple and complex. But, that means a lot of things. It means supporting programs and policies that promote youth well-being, like quality early learning programs and strong schools, enrichment programs that take place after school or during the summer, having people in your life who care about you, whether it's your family or mentors or peers. It means access to good jobs with decent wages. And it also means having stable housing and safe communities. So our foundation, we use our resources, whether it's our grant making, our platforms, and our voice, or the expertise that we as individuals may bring to these roles. We use our resources to do all of those things. And I'm fortunate to lead our place-based work at the foundation. So in addition to our hometowns, Baltimore, where our national offices sit, and Atlanta, which is our second hometown, the foundation works with leaders and communities across the country to support young people and families.
Well, that's excellent. And so you can tell us a little bit more about the work you do at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And you've got this Changing the Odds report. I do want to dive into that because it's really fascinating. And I think we'll have this in our show notes for my listeners. You can find out more information about it because it's very new information and it's really a thorough report. But first, let's just give you an opportunity to talk about what are some of the biggest takeaways that people should know about this report?
Sure. And thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk about the report. This is actually the third Changing the Odds report. And we released the first report in 2015, the second report in 2019, just before the pandemic. And then this latest report was released earlier this month. And looking at the trend data that one will see when they get a chance to look at the report, you'll note that there is a lot to celebrate. There have been important gains that have been made for young people and families and what the change in the odds data does is it looks at a number of indicators across education, economic opportunity, and community, which includes housing and safety, disaggregates that data so that we really understand who's doing well and who's being left. And having that disaggregated data gives us an opportunity to work collectively with partners, nonprofit leaders, philanthropic leaders, business leaders, government leaders, to identify solutions that work that can, in essence, change the odds. And since that initial report in 2015, we've seen some really good progress. We've seen record high school graduation rates for young people in Atlanta across almost all demographics. Black residents have experienced the highest rates of employment growth in the city of Atlanta. And now the majority of Atlanta's children, they now live in low poverty, not low income, but low poverty neighborhoods, which, those are all great things. And so I am extremely excited and hopeful when I think about that progress. But I also see that there's still a lot more work that we all need to do. In the report, we have a map of the city of Atlanta, and I-20, which is a major highway, is kind of like the dividing line. And what the readers of the reports will see is that when we think about families of color, kids of color in the city of Atlanta, particularly those that live south of I-20, that's where the disparities are most. The report highlights a number of disparities. The median earnings for Black households are about a third of what white households have, and that gap has grown. Atlanta's income, savings, and delinquent debt disparities have produced the second lowest economic mobility numbers. And, a lot of us talk about the impact that the pandemic has had on young people, especially school-aged students. And, the learning loss for kids of color, it's just been particularly devastating. There have been a series of articles over the past couple of days about chronic absences from schools. And, right. And, is that an outgrowth of the pandemic with young people still learning to adjust and figuring out how to catch up? But, our report shows that third grade reading and math scores for Black students, they plunged. And it's like really putting their futures in jeopardy. And those kinds of stats, Rob, that just doesn't line up with the image of Atlanta as this place of possibility where a good life is available to anybody who puts in the work.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing that. And as my listeners know, of course, my whole podcast is dedicated to leadership, specifically nonprofit leadership. And I know a lot of your work at the foundation really helps the nonprofit sector directly. So as you've already been touching base a bit on this report, could you talk a little bit more about some of the lessons that the nonprofit sector can learn from your Changing the Odds report, and specifically what the Annie E. Casey Foundation, what their work is doing more broadly, perhaps? Maybe you could touch on that.
Yeah, so I just want to plug that prior to joining the foundation in late 2016, I ran a nonprofit in Baltimore, Baltimore's Promise, that is still going strong today under a fantastic leader. But that nonprofit was focused on improving cradle to career outcomes for young people. But at the core of that work is this notion of collective work, collective impact. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons, I think, from not just my time in the nonprofit sector, but prior to that, I was in government and now being in philanthropy. It really doesn't matter what seat I'm in. What I recognize is, this kind of work, the work of supporting people in communities, it's hard. It's really hard. And no one person, no one organization can do it alone. And I think that everybody has a role, whether it's nonprofit leaders or the business community or philanthropy. And so we all have to come together to figure out, what role can we play? How can we change those odds? Now, for nonprofits, I think oftentimes, and I'm thinking of my most immediate experience with Baltimore's Promise or my experience, almost 20 years ago leading reentry work, working with formerly incarcerated individuals at a nonprofit. Typically, nonprofits are closest to the issues and the people who are impacted by the issues that we're trying to solve. And nonprofit leaders can often use their platforms to elevate the importance of voice and voice of the people who are impacted by the issues that the collective we are trying to address, and also elevating the importance of agency. How do we deliberately and strategically include those impacted by the issues we're trying to address to really help define and understand the problem and develop solutions? Co-creating solutions and shaping the work together, it fosters greater buy-in and support, and also increases the likelihood that those solutions will have traction. And that's something that the folks who work in the community change sector of the Casey Foundation, the team that I lead, something that we really hold for to the work that we do, ensuring that we are engaging those who are closest to the issue and working collectively with a number of stakeholders to try to figure out the best solution. In our role as a funder, it's sometimes bringing dollars to the table. It's sometimes bringing thought partnership because we may have done other things before being in these roles. And sometimes it's helping them to learn about, other work that somebody else may have done in another community to address that issue and bringing those lessons and those innovations to their places.
Well, I know the foundation works all over the country, and one of your successful initiatives, of course, is in the city of Atlanta, which you've just briefly talked about. So for my listeners, why is the foundation interested in Atlanta specifically? Because I know it was a very intentional choice to invest in Atlanta.
Well, as I mentioned at the top of our conversation, Atlanta is our second hometown. I think most listeners might know that Annie E. Casey was the mother of Jim Casey, the founder of UPS. So we have our roots, our genesis story is closely tied with UPS. UPS relocated to the city of Atlanta, and the Casey Foundation began to have a really deep presence in that city back in 2001, initially focused in Southwest Atlanta, working in a cluster of communities below I-20, trying to identify in partnership with residents solutions to some of the more deeply entrenched issues that are preventing young people and families from thriving. And, the other thing is that Atlanta has a lot of assets, but, unfortunately, as the report highlights, there is some uneven progress that really conflicts with what many of us imagine Atlanta to be, a place that, has boomed and that has one of the busiest airports in the world, if not the busiest airport, that is viewed by many as a mecca for entrepreneurship, a place where if people have goals and work hard, they can be successful. So how do we change that and make sure that opportunity is open to everyone and that no one, especially kids of color, are, given the impression that it means everybody except for them.
Right. Yeah, and you're starting to speak about this already. Let's talk a little bit more about this. What have you seen already in terms of policymakers and leaders working together to remove these barriers? What have they done already? What can they continue to do to really truly move these barriers for all of Atlanta's residents?
Yeah, I think that there are a number of things that policymakers can do. They can, with input from community, nonprofit partners, private sector, they can invest in policies and practices that provide equitable development and more affordable housing opportunities for residents. Atlanta, like many cities, they've seen lots of growth But in that city, housing remains in short supply. I think our report highlights in 2021 alone, Atlanta fell more than 100,000 houses short of meeting existing housing. Now, the city has put something in place, something innovative. It's called House ATL. It is a cross-sector collaborative that's actually housed out of the Atlanta Community Foundation, but it's government, nonprofit organizations like enterprise, philanthropy, and they are collectively working on a goal to create more than 20,000 units of affordable housing, and using a combination of public and private funding to make that happen, and trying to figure out how to do that in a way that's not cumbersome on developers or cumbersome on community. And so I think that's a great, cross-sector example of folks coming together, developing a solution that makes sense, but there is collective action. I think that more can be done to invest in community-led solutions to challenges. In the wake of the first report, there was a lot of energy around doing something about community violence. In the Southwest cluster of neighborhoods where we've been working, Atlanta is divided into something called neighborhood planning. That was actually something created by former Mayor Maynard Jackson to make it easier for service delivery, for community mobilization and support. And so much of the foundation's work had been clustered in NPUZ, a cluster of neighborhoods that's south of that I-20 divide. And after that first report, we started working with residents in NPUZ and an organization called Chris 180 to design solutions to address violence in the community.
We'll be right back. Are you looking for an easy and effective way to boost your nonprofit's donations? Look no further than DonorBox, the online fundraising platform that streamlines your fundraising efforts, maximizes donations, and simplifies giving for your supporters. With DonorBox, you can create beautiful donation forms, accept digital wallet payments, track donations, and send auto receipts. And the best part? There are no setup or monthly fees and no long-term contracts required. So what are you waiting for? Visit donorbox.org today to get started. That is donorbox.org. Are you ready to revolutionize your advocacy efforts and significantly impact policy change? Discover Quorum and level up your advocacy to better educate more lawmakers. Quorum is the only unified public affairs platform that empowers nonprofits to map, track, change, and report on the policy landscape, all in one place. Explore how Quorum Grassroots helps nonprofits create compelling campaigns in minutes. The result? Your nonprofit doesn't just participate in the advocacy, it drives it. Quorum, where influence meets innovation. You can learn more at quorum.us. Hey friends, and thanks so much for listening to the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. I want to let you know that I've recently become a professional certified coach. With my nearly 30 years of nonprofit experience, I know firsthand how hard you work as a leader. I also know how important it is to have someone you can call on to get help with the barriers, the leadership challenges that you will face both professionally and personally. And I really want people to thrive, to become all they were meant to become by providing coaching and consulting services. So if coaching is something you've always been interested in, but maybe weren't quite sure what it was all about, I encourage you to reach out. You can go to my website, robharder.com, or just email me at rob@robharder.com. I would happy to provide a free sample coaching session so you can determine if coaching is for you. All right, thanks again for tuning in. Now back to the show. Well, it's really clear that the foundation really has been a catalyst, it sounds like, to work with local leaders, policy leaders, as well as nonprofit leaders, community leaders, in order to address these really big issues that are negatively affecting the community there. You've already given some great examples. Is there any other initiatives that have really pushed the needle forward when it comes to reducing disparities that you're seeing there in Atlanta?
Yeah, there are a number of examples. One of the things that I neglected to mention was when the initial report was released, it was intended to not just be a static report that gets placed on a shelf, but a living document that's meant to serve as a call to action for many. And the members of my Atlanta team with their partners launched something called the Changing the Odds Network. It is a cross-sector network of over 60 organizations, and they meet regularly. They are focused on some critical issues and developing strategies together, but they're also thinking about what they can do in their individual roles to, increase access to opportunity for young people and families. But it's using that data. And this network is still going strong. So at the launch from that 2015 report through 2019 to today, and for anybody who's in Atlanta who wants to be involved in the work to help to cultivate solutions, the door is open for those members. And I think the Change in the Odds network is the machinery to a lot of the positive actions that have been taking place and some of the progress that's been made. And so I think the theme for everybody to remember is just the importance of collective action. And it could be even as simple as being in a room and understanding who's doing what, where, how, for whom, what gaps remain to help you to think about where you might want to plug it or where there might be a role for you, but more importantly, where the needle's being moved and where it is.
Yeah, and I think it gets into the next question really is when you think about my listeners, most of them are nonprofit leaders. What would you say to nonprofit leaders working in their own communities to really strengthen their communities, to remove the barriers to success in that community? That way too many families, I'm guessing, in their communities are facing similar things to Atlanta. Any lessons you'd like to share from your work?
A couple of things. I think it's important to understand who else is in the space. Before starting an after school meals program for young people, is there somebody else providing a similar service? If they are, do they have the capacity to serve all the young people walking through their doors? And if they don't, then maybe your role is to, fill those gaps. Are there limitations to what they can do based on funding guidelines or space limitations? So having a sense as to who else is doing similar work, who's working in that space is important. Having a sense of who might be doing work that could complement what you're trying to do is important. So there may not be any other meals programs, but it's a program that provides tutoring and recreation support. And wouldn't those meals be a great complement to that? And so that means understanding the landscape, understanding what supports exist, what gaps exist, and how your calling or your charge might align with that or might conflict with that. As a funder, I think one of the challenges that I often see is people are really passionate about issues and they have a good idea and solutions, and they immediately want to start a nonprofit to address it without first thinking about, is this need already being addressed in some way already in my community? By whom? To what degree is it being addressed? Where's the delta? How might I plug in? Because as a funder, I might ask you, well, Rob, this sounds really similar to a program that is over here. Are you aware of them? A lot of times as funders, we may connect folks if they don't know each other so that they can have that conversation to see if there's synergy. Sometimes there is synergy, sometimes there isn't. So the first tip is understand the landscape, understand how what you currently offer or what you might want to offer fits into that landscape. Second is, what are you solving with the work? And then how do you know that what you're doing is actually having an impact on the issue you set out to solve? And that does mean data, whether we're talking about quantitative data with counting the number of people who walk through the doors, the number of people who get a hot meal, number of people you have to turn away because you don't have space or you run out of food. It could also be qualitative, telling those stories, having a young person say, I was so hungry, but thank goodness I was able to get that meal. I was able to get a good night's rest so I could get up fresh for school. Those stories are also very powerful. And that helps you to know what difference you've actually been able to make. And I think it's important for nonprofit leaders to think about that. Last thing I'll say is that I don't think we do enough storytelling as providers. I mentioned that 20 years ago, I was running the reentry program. I was terrified to tell stories back then because I thought if I, had a bright spotlight on the work that I was doing, the moment something bad happened, the doors of my, program would close. And I know that I missed so many opportunities to celebrate the wins that the men in the program achieved, but to also use what I was learning through those innovations to push for policy change within state correctional systems. And so I think, with nonprofit leaders, not being afraid to tell stories about what's working, but also what's not.
Yeah.
That's just as important.
No, really good. And what I'm hearing you saying as a funder, because you're a foundation, right, that really you stress and you have a high value on collaboration with other nonprofits in your area, and just really the idea of collective impact, that together multiple nonprofits can have a much bigger impact than these solo nonprofits trying to do things on their own. Would that be accurate?
Yeah. And that also gives us an opportunity to see whole people and whole families. So if you are a workforce development provider, or if someone else has a clothing program, somebody else provides housing, someone else provides counseling, think about how that collective power coming together, kind of like to provide a host of wraparound supports for a young person or a family. That's also the power of collective connection and collective action.
Yeah. Great Avengers analogy. Way to go. That's a good one.
I'm a pop culture dork.
Perfect. Well, for my listeners, how can people find out a little bit more about you and find out more about the Annie E. Casey Foundation?
You can check us out at www.necs.org. You can sign up for our newsletters. As I mentioned, I help lead our community change work. There's a community change newsletter that talks about the work that we're doing, not just in Baltimore and Atlanta, but in other communities across the country. And it highlights some really exciting work that many of our partners are doing across the country.
Well, Tomi, thanks for what you're doing, and thanks for investing in not just Atlanta, but through the foundation, you're doing so many good things, investing in the nonprofit sector. And again, thanks for taking time out to be on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, friends. Well, I wanted you to know that this podcast can be found on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, Google Podcasts, and wherever you listen to other podcasts. I also want to encourage you to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with others. This will actually help us get this great content out to more nonprofit leaders just like you. You can also join the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast community. Find other resources and interviews of past guests all on my website, nonprofitleadershippodcast.org. Well, thanks again for listening. And until next time, keep making your world better. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, the Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. Go to YouTube and look up Nonprofit Leadership Podcast. We'll see you there. This podcast is sponsored by DonorBox. DonorBox, helping you help others with the best donation forms in the business.